Hello and welcome to World Talks with me, Hashim Kumar. More than 11 billion euros. That's the hit that the Polish economy has taken this last year due to competition from China. A new report by a Polish think tank shows the scale of the hollowing out that the country's industry faces if action is not taken. Well, what should this action be, and what does the situation mean for Poland specifically and Europe as a whole in the geopolitical context? Well, laying it all out for us is Grzegorz Stec. He's senior analyst at Mercator Institute for China Studies and, according to Politico in 2023, one of the Power 40 list of influential policy figures in Brussels. Grzegorz, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Good to have you. So tell me, how would you characterize EU-China relations at the moment?
It's definitely one that is characterized predominantly by tensions, and the general calculus from EU's perspective has been changing in this relationship. It's really one in which China wants to keep the status quo of having the open market to be able to offset the overcapacity that Chinese economy and the Chinese model is producing by access to Europe. So the cost benefit from Europe's perspective has been shifting. There are increasingly more and more challenges and costs of the relationship with China rather than benefits. And this is what leads to just simply more tensions.
Yeah, but it's not just status quo. I mean, China's increasing its, the volumes and value of trade with Europe. It's not a balance. It may have been at some stage, but no longer. Would you agree?
Absolutely. By status quo here, I mean the fact that China wants to maintain the access to the European market. In many ways, China's agenda towards Europe is a preventive one. It's about preventing or delaying the limitations on access to the European market, the limitations on access to European technology. So China just wants to avoid exactly those type of responses and more assertive policy that Brussels would want to see and implement. And in that sense, it's exactly those tensions related to an increasing trade imbalance, the question of China just basically going up the value chains and overflooding the European markets with the goods that are produced with a lot of subsidies, a lot of unfair competition that is basically coming to the European market and is leading Europe to deindustrialize and lose the capacity to compete. And this is not just about the industries that we already see now in place, but also the future ones. So the discussion here is not just about competitiveness of European economy right now, but also the future challenges in the context of robotics, embodied AI, 6G, the list goes on. And this is only when we talk about economics. Of course, there are also other issues that remain a challenge when it comes to cybersecurity, challenges to national security, or China's relationship with Russia.
Right. Well, I mean, the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, has been talking about de-risking Europe, and she was referring, of course, to Russian fuel and gas that Europe was buying. But surely there's an even bigger argument for de-risking from China. What would you say to that argument?
Absolutely. De-risking has been initially unveiled in 2023 in the context of China specifically. Of course, it has broadened since then in the context of other areas and Europe's general quest for strategic autonomy. But in essence, de-risking has from the beginning been a discussion in the context of China. And that relates to the two challenges that Europe faces. It's exactly those national security challenges. Here we had the discussions about the inclusion of Chinese telecommunication components, like the discussion about usage of Huawei in 5G networks. But we also have a separate trade defense discussion that is unfolding in Europe. And that's exactly the question of China's domestic economic model and the techno-industrial solutionist bet that the CCP is really betting on, the impact that this has on European industries, this is something that is becoming more and more pressing. We're talking here not only about 1 billion euros of trade deficit daily throughout this year, that's the estimation that is expected. We've seen 360 billion euros of deficit in trade and goods throughout 2025, but we're also talking here about the jobs that are being lost across Europe. According to estimations, it's around 500 manufacturing jobs that are being lost in Europe every single day. And we've just seen the announcements coming from, for example, Volkswagen, that is planning to cut 100,000 jobs across European market, largely because of focusing on the Chinese market and the competition with Chinese companies.
So there hasn't been much de-risking going on, has there, in the 3 years since the EU said it was going to implement that policy, has there?
That would not be fully fair to the real and meaningful progress that has been done on the European side. We're talking here about significant instruments that have been put into place by Brussels, whether that comes to the questions related to new export control regimes, the foreign direct investment screening, or indeed a very ambitious for the European perspective discussions that are unfolding right now with new instruments such as new Industrial Accelerator Act, new Cybersecurity Act that could potentially cut China out of certain segments of the European market. So there are definitely moves that are now being in place. We had the European Council really giving a green light for a number of those instruments to be really developed and locked in now in June. But the key question is going to be now about really unfolding and implementing them. And that, to a large extent, also points to the responsibility of the member states. So in many ways, a lot of preparatory ground and new tools have been put in place in the context of de-risking. We've seen some movement, but the actual very big political push for action needs to come from the capitals. And this is what we're hoping to see in October at the next European Council.
How united are EU countries in this idea, in this push?
It's always a tricky question. Given the nature of the EU, we're never going to have full unity on any given topic. That's just the nature of the EU. But I think especially the last council that happened now in June really showed the consensus in terms of acknowledgement of the challenge that China poses right now to European economy and the push that it can create to basically deindustrializing and killing European manufacturing capacity. So in that sense, there is definitely now a political momentum to actually act. And it's really important that this comes right now, ahead of 2027, when we're going to see elections in France, elections in Poland, elections in Spain and in Italy. So this is going to be politically more tricky moment, and the ambitious decisions with support of the member states should basically come this fall.
Is de-risking enough, Grzegorz, or should we really be thinking about decoupling? Because, while these instruments that you mentioned are being put into place, and while the elections are going on, and while the EU is getting its message unified, Europe is losing 500 jobs a day. Surely we can't afford to keep doing that without losing a fundamental part of our qualified workforce.
Of course, and this is the very big argument for the cost of inaction that Europe faces, and this is why the need for new tools to be locked in is absolutely now. The solution to a large extent is just not decoupling, because we just simply cannot afford this. Important thing to note is that neither can China, given the fact that Beijing already faces a situation in which around 20% of its SOEs are basically state-owned enterprises, are facing losses. They're not generating revenue. So access to external markets where they're able to at least offset some of those costs of this big techno-industrial push that China is going through are able to be cushioned. So in that sense, both sides are in a very tricky position. And it's really important that the change that we're seeing right now in Europe is not one going towards decoupling. It's about trying to address the issue we face with China in a systemic way. The tools used to be focused on addressing issues one by one. We're now moving with those new instruments that we talked about a moment ago. They're much more systemic. They go through different sectors. They basically create ground rules across different sectors. So there is a lot that Europe can do already with those measures that are currently under discussion. It's really about implementing them quickly and making sure that they are not being watered down as the political process of locking them in goes through.
Now, there's a fundamental difference, isn't there, between the democracies in Europe and the Chinese state in the time horizons in which they make their decisions. In Europe, other democracies, time horizons are much shorter between governments and so on, and we're looking, I don't know, maybe 3 or 5 years down the road, whereas Chinese policy making is for far longer. How much does that difference in attitude have on what's happening in Europe today?
Of course, it has a very significant outlook. It's one of the reasons why this is now a politically tricky situation for European leaders to actually push for potentially costly measures in the context of China, because we can expect retaliation from Beijing on ambitious measures that will be coming from the European side, simply because for China retaining access to the European single market is existential for the economy. So there will be a pushback. On the European side, that political argument is creating exactly this reluctance on the side of the leadership, because a cost that will be incurred by the population might affect the decisions that they're going to make at the voting boxes. So this definitely remains in place. But at the same time, I think it's also important that while there is a certain level of, let's say, upper hand that China has, thanks to its long-term planning and ability to guide the capital, this is also exactly what's creating a lot of problems that China has right now. Because Beijing, in many ways, is overinvesting and overproducing. This doesn't allow for corrections of the economy and can lead to a significant crisis. And this is what's making Beijing, at the same time, more confident with the push and the development that they're achieving, but also more desperate and anxious in the context of problems that are festering across the economy and society.
OK, now, Grzegorz, in the last few seconds that we have left, and I would invite you to keep your answer brief, please, is it possible for the European Union to differentiate between trade with China and China's support for Russia, while it's condemning Russia for its policies and imposing sanctions on Russia?
Indeed, those have been, to a certain extent, two the discussions that Europe has been trying to pursue on separate tracks. I think it's actually exactly now that we're going towards a discussion that those two are being brought together, because talking with China on issues separately just doesn't work. This is not how Beijing thinks about things. So if we are to actually address the challenges, we have to have a very coherent solution that tackles all the issues and is able to pursue trade-offs and negotiate between those.
OK, well, it'll be interesting to see what the European solution is to all of that. Grzegorz Stec, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a wonderful evening. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.